Well, hello and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. A special treat for you today, yet again, back by unpopular demand.
That's yet to be decided how special that treat is, but
Mark is back for,
yes.
well, thank you for coming back, Mark.
Well, I'm starting to regret it because it's a sunny but deadly chilly day here in Michigan today.
It's a perfect day for a sporty
car. It is.
car.
There's still some snow around if that's even in, I'm not even sure if we capture that, but yeah.
Well, at least we wanted to get together and talk about what I think Mark and I would say is one of the most beautiful cars of the 1980s.
Now, I don't know how I get dragged into these things, but okay.
I'll attribute that to you. I'll say it's one of the most beautiful cars of the 1980s. How about, we'll let you render your opinion.
Well, this is a matter, that's an editorial, it's a matter of opinion, but it's an interesting one. It's actually a significant one because it carries a few interesting trivia bits and a little bit of background, and it's significant in many ways, good and bad.
Good and bad. Well, yeah, so this is, for those who don't know, this is my 1982 Trans Am. It's the first year of the third generation, and it has a number of, let's say, quite a bit of content that was 1 or 2 year only. The so-called bowling ball wheel covers were 82, 83, and 15-inch, 84 and 14-inch. It has unique door sill plates. The instrument panel is 1 year with the double faux stitching on the front as well. The Viscount bucket seats, which were 1982, 1983. The shifter, which I believe is in 1982, maybe some vehicles in 1983 as well. And altogether, this is a pretty highly optioned car. Low mileage, 35,000 miles. And for those who watch the channel, you know I love the big full-size luxury cars or near luxury cars.
That has escaped me completely.
That's right. But this is actually the first non-daily driver car I ever bought. I've had this car since 2005. So I've owned it for a very long time, bought it from Minnesota, and thought it would be good because it was such a, to Mark's point, a significant design that we should have a true designer on here.
And this being what it is, I have to make the disclaimer again because I currently still work for the outfit and I plan to continue to do so, but I had nothing to do with this because when these things were done, of course, I was just a wee little lad and you weren't even a gleam in your parents' eye. So.
Well, in any case, this car was not much about horsepower. It has the looks, if you will, but under the hood, this has the highest optional 305 cubic inch, 165 horsepower crossfire injection engine, which you can only get with the automatic transmission. So in spite of it being a Trans Am, top of the line Firebird, it doesn't have a lot of horsepower. About an 8.5 second 0 to 60 car.
I'm going to take that back what I just said because your 86 Oldsmobile does not predate you.
Or my 84 Omega.
Oh, that's right. I almost forgot about that one.
Seville.
And that's not even a totally, well, it is a forgettable car, so never mind.
Oh, come on. It's an Omega Brome.
If it had the waterfall grill, I'd say, I'd remember it more, but it's an 84.
Yeah, from the 80, 81 version, yeah.
No, it's a lovely car.
But maybe let's just take the camera off and Mark will do a bit of a design walk around and talk more about some of the interesting styling features of this car, because at least from my perspective, I think it's absolutely beautiful. Even today, it's one of those cars where every few years I think about selling it, because of the mechanical bits, and it's not all that well engineered or put together, but it is phenomenally beautiful.
Which is hinting at the key narrative about these vehicles and the era they emanate from. So
I think that's very fair. Well, let's take the camera off and walk around it and hear from Mark. All right, well, Mark, take it away and describe some of the...
I'm not taking it away, that would be theft, but no, it's obvious. I think we started with this kind of side view taking it in the whole thing. It's a wedge, and it's a bit of a manifestation of the fashions of the time again. The 1970s, early 80s were really dominated by the wedge. There were many interpretations of the wedge representing speed and force and forward thrust and movement. And there were many representations of the wedge design. It was really fresh. The Lancia Stratos, for instance, the concept cars, the Fiat Roadsters of the 1970s.
The Subaru XT.
Then there's that, but that was a little later. That was a little later in the 80s. But I'm thinking about TR7s and vehicles like this. So some of the British cars like the Princess, and quite a few Italian cars of the time, even the DeLorean is kind of in that genre, where the wedge is a theme, a motif that was really powerful, and starting in the late 60s, I think, and then really dominating the late 70s, early 80s design until a very organic phase. So this car has definitely a very strong wedge theme to it, but it also has a few other things that were very typical of GM in the era of it, and also It's got a few interesting engineering and execution details that are quite unique to not just GM, but that particular phase in the industry. I want to point out a few things. First of all, this is a hatchback interpretation of the Camaro Firebird style sports car, which is really a four-seater, but it's supposed to project more of a two-seater Gran Turismo kind of feeling by emphasizing that big giant pillar, which is placed where normally people in the second row want to see out of the car. So it's sort of a manifestation in the design theme of where the emphasis is. It's on the first row.
The so-called basket handle.
Right,
here.
the basket handle. Corvettes had it, you know, and the previous generation had it too, but that was still a notchback with a separate trunk. This one is a hatchback. And then this being a hatchback, it has something that GM was extremely fond of and pioneering in many ways, which is the all-glass hatch, a structurally very thin, almost impossible kind of dome-shaped glass panel that is both structural because it has the hinges put right into it, and it's also formed in an impossible way with the accompanying scrap rates, which is why we don't see that much of that anymore today. But it has a lot of form. It has a lot of flow. It actually is very three-dimensional.
What's interesting is it's kind of a similar form to the 77 Caprice coupes that had the hot wire bend, but there's no hot wire bend here.
GM was always not the only one. They weren't the only ones, but they were pretty much on the cutting edge of experimenting with forming glass and forming materials. Remember, this was almost contemporary to the Fiero, the Corvette, of course, being a fiberglass car, having mixed materials, mixed media vehicles, having different processes to make it, whether it's plastics, you know, resins, fiberglass, or it's injection molded plastics. I mean, a lot of the vehicles of the era in the 80s and early 90s had plastic fenders, plastic body panels. Saturn, the creation of the Saturn division famously falls into that time frame. And this one has all kinds of little interesting attempts to be innovative and different in the execution of some components of the vehicle. And of course, the motif here, the driving force behind it, was to incorporate the glass, which is a difficult material to form and a difficult material to integrate into a vehicle structure and body, to integrate that into the shape of the vehicle in a very elegant and seamless way. And I think they did succeed, not just on this car, but on many others they did, because the challenges are obvious. You have to have processes to make the glass robust and rigid so it doesn't shatter. It can take some stresses and some loads. It has to do that repeatedly in all kinds of temperatures and climate situations like the one we're in right now. You got the sun coming down.
True.
It's really cold, so you've got, you know, on the cold side of the car you have a lot of stress. On the hot side of the car where the sun is, you get a lot of thermal expansion. You got to manage all this stuff. And then when you open and close the hatch, you don't want this thing to shatter into 1,000 pieces. So there's a lot of material engineering, a lot of chemistry, a lot of trial and error, a lot of testing involved to make this actually happen for manufacturing.
Now, you talked about it being a wedge shape, but it seems like in the more recent years, the wedge shape meant that the car had a big butt. You know, like this belt line kept rising and rising. This has a very low belt line.
Which is also typical of the period. That's a thing in the 1970s and 80s. We see the time of the low belt line, the thin pillars, the glassy, airy interiors. There was no driver assist systems, electronic ones or otherwise, that would compensate for the lack of visibility that we have today. Today the visibility is compromised because A, we have giant vehicles, and B, the structure is enormous because of the crash worthiness that has to be engineered in vehicles. These were, they satisfied the then existing safety and crash regulations, but of course any car, even the quote-unquote famously safety-minded cars from the 60s, 70s, 80s, I'm thinking Volvo, Mercedes, those brands, they would fail quite miserably in today's environment, because today's cars are just a magnitude of 5, 6, 7 times safer in terms of crash worthiness than the vehicles were, 40, 50, 60 years ago, just in terms of being able to take impact forces. And these cars could be thinner and lighter, and the belt lines are lower, and everything is just engineered to be giving you maximum visibility and sort of a feeling of lightness. And generally, people associated lowness, of course, especially a sports car, with sportiness, and it was an achievement. Longer, lower, wider was the mantra of Detroit automotive design for many decades, and these sort of typify this well into the 80s and 90s.
It is interesting because it has, to your point, some of the sports car proportions, but it doesn't have long dash to axle, and the wheels aren't pushed out to the corners. It's got pretty big overhangs.
It does have pretty big overhangs, but that was not necessary to get a sporty look. That's one way to get a sporty look is, the Jaguar E-Type, the really, really long dash to axle, but even the Jaguar E-Type has a pretty long front overhang because of the way the curvature in plan view goes and the way how droopy the snout is. So when you have a vehicle with a very pointy, pencil-thin front end like this one has, it comes to almost a flat, impossibly flat point, you naturally have a long overhang because, you've got to get back over the wheels, so you get
you have to the
quite a bit of
suspension,
length.
basically.
Exactly, so it's unavoidable. Plus, this wouldn't look right. It wants a long hood, and it's not a law that if you have a longer front overhang, especially on a rear-wheel drive car, that automatically translates into a proportion that's not suitable. It's just that this really short front overhang, very long dash to axle is one very, very powerful proportion that communicates that, but you don't have to have that.
Interesting. Well, let's look at some of the details and kind of do a quick walk around.
Sure.
Then.
Start with the front. That's obvious. The front here is all about lowness and all about cutting the wind and cheating the wind. So a very, very low aspect ratio. This is like my knees here. I'm sort of level with the tip of the bumper. Interesting here is that it has a sort of a hybrid execution of the lamp assembly. We have the pop-up headlights under doors that are fitting with, shall we say, creative leisure, and which is typical of the era. Look at the gap here; it's almost shut, and then here I can stick my pinky in it. And we have a totally different gap scenario on the other side.
That's fine.
Thanks to the angle of the sun is lifting, we can see the shadow fall over the fender. So you have things being overflush and subflush, and we've got this one rotate a little up. So without being too hard on, this is a moving part, and all moving parts, they move, and they're difficult to register precisely, especially over long periods of time. So these are very tricky, difficult things to execute to make sure they have quality. And on a 40-plus-year-old car, and this car is now over 40 years old.
It's hard to believe.
41 years old, hard to believe.
The sunlight really shows off the surfacing of the hood there, too.
Yes, there's a lot of sculpture and asymmetrical scoop arrangement, and actually we have a little... There's no instruments in here, is there?
No,
this is
just mesh.
It's just
the
an extracted
8081
end,
with the turbocharger had it. This car was
Right.
supposed to have the
So,
turbo 301.
Interesting. So it's got that ducted fairing to create that little hooded brow, which is neat. I always like these designed out. If they're not too big and look too aggressive, I think they're a neat opportunity to do some interesting sculpting on the surface, and they did it certainly very nicely here. Discreet screaming chicken here.
Yeah, a lot smaller.
So, a lot smaller than they were able to put on those hoods back in the 1970s and early 80s on the predecessor generation. But an interesting hybrid arrangement of some turn signals and exposed portions of the lamps versus the hidden headlights, and it does give a very sneaky, very stealth kind of look to it and also adding a little bit of interest to the front end. And of course, legally you had to expose the turn signals. You have to make sure that not everything is hidden. So this was actually a very clever way of combining the hidden headlamp with the parts of the lighting that had to be exposed. I thought that was a neat trick. One of the things that was interesting is that aerodynamically, these scoops are always problematic because you have vertical little walls here and little trapped
little vortices
surfaces
or something.
You're trapping air. But this is low enough where it probably doesn't make that big of a difference. But in many other American cars of the period, because of the sealed beam laws, you couldn't have the composite headlamps yet. That was not until later in the 80s when that became legal. So you really couldn't put flush covers over the headlight areas. So that was always a challenge for the designers in those days to combine the satisfaction of the legal requirements with a good look, because of course most designers would have loved to have the integrated look. And they did a nice job here by reducing these pockets for the exposed lamp portions to an absolute minimum, and that helps sort of the stealthy, sneaky appearance. So I think it's quite nice. Together with that big sweeping hood, and even though the shapes themselves are light and they're not massive and they're not very voluminous, the car has a very authoritative presence. The front end is certainly there. It's a vehicle you don't miss in traffic, even though it's not huge.
The pointy mirrors kind of help with the look too, I think.
Of course, everything in these cars was styled, and it was styled to fit the theme of the wedge and piercing the wind. And so you have these rally type mirror housings that are very pointy in the front and they flare out. I don't know how valuable this kind of shape really is for aerodynamics, because this edge is actually probably more important in aerodynamics the forward edge here, but they're definitely more aerodynamic than just flat boards in the wind. But they, of course, primarily also styled to go with the rest of the car.
And they also have the door handle sticking out proud, very
Well,
significantly
that's something.
for a good.
Yeah, here's a wonderful example of 1980s quality. Look at the way these paddle type door handles are not integrated to the. And they sound great too. I hope this picks up. Oh my goodness, I don't think I've ever grabbed the driver's side door handle on this car. I know I grabbed the passenger side. This is, wow, that's an experience. It's like a theme park. They should make this a ride.
You know, it doesn't have big wheels, but they don't look out of proportion.
Well,
though.
it's because the whole car's
It's
low.
low,
I mean,
yeah.
you've got volumes over the wheel openings that are reasonable. They're very low. So one of the problems with today's vehicles, for aero reasons and for the aforementioned structural requirements, they keep getting bulkier and bulkier. And no matter how much you blow up and pump up the wheels and the rims, you're always going to lose the low to the ground effect you get with this sort of arrangement. This is a 16-inch. 15 or
15.
15. See,
You overthought. Yeah.
you over project on these because they'd certainly look like 16s or 17s on this body proportion, but they're only 15s and they look reasonably big, and they fill out the wheel wells nicely. These cars always had a decent stance compared to the mainstream of American cars, so the way they sit on the road on the street is appropriate. It's not, they don't look overbodied and look like they have big hollow wheelhouses like a lot of contemporary American vehicles of the time had. They have a nicely proportioned wheel-to-body relationship and a good track and stance and very handsomely proportioned on the road.
I met with John Chanella, who was the chief designer
Yes,
for this vehicle,
yes,
and he
of
told me
course.
he didn't like the fact that I called them bowling ball hubcaps.
Well,
but
yeah, the bowling ball.
Yes.
Let's go Steve right here.
Exactly.
Right? Fingers in there,
That's right.
and they have that shiny lacquered surface, and yeah.
But they were supposed to be clip-ons over a styled wheel underneath, so you had two different
Yes.
looks. And I'll put a picture in the video of what Pontiac later came out with, the other wheel that was supposed to be behind the bowling ball as its own wheel, and they kind of cheaped out on.
It's a neat idea, but those are always problematic in the real world and in the customer use scenarios, because just like modular interiors and things like that, people never really do that, or the only modularity you get is when those things fall off and you drive around with them.
These are
exposed.
siliconed on, so they don't fall
But
off.
see, there's an issue here. Yes.
I love the smoked glass tail light.
So this is
too.
a GM motif from the late 70s, early 80s. This was a popular styling gimmick they pulled on a lot of vehicles. So one thing, we have the wall-to-wall tail lamps, which is a very American thing, monochromatic under a smoked lens. So because the requirements in the US did not require different color and light
amber,
separation,
yeah.
amber and versus a certain distance. The brake light had to be a certain distance from the driving light, which had to be a certain distance from the fog lamp and a certain distance from the backup lights. In the US, the laws were different. You could do everything in one color, and you had the two-way bulbs that allowed both stop lamp and turn signal to be under one electrical bulb, which is completely illegal in Europe. You have to have a very clear separation between the signal-giving lamps on the vehicle. In the US, it's not so clear, so you could do these wall-to-wall tail lamps, you could do these really sneaky, modern-looking effects. It's always an envy. I think there was always a bit of an envy of the European design community that the Americans could have a lot more freedom in terms of styling the rear ends of the cars with a lamp integration. Things have changed a little. They've sort of converged a little bit these days. But in those days, American cars were always the ones with the wall-to-wall tail lamps and the really cool look. One of the cars that was sort of crossing over were the European GM cars, the Opels. They had the Opel Senator and Monza range had a very similar execution with a smoked glass and the sort of wall-to-wall tail lamp execution, which was one of the few examples you saw these cars of this style in Europe. Europeanized a little bit, but still very American looking. And then also what's interesting, you have these louvers, which is the beginning of the ridgy Pontiac theme. This is something that we see a lot more on later Pontiacs as the 80s and 90s.
Theme.
It's the rib theme. For some reason that creates when you have blinds,
Yes.
you see this on appliques over the rear glass sometimes too. You've got these blinds which they're supposed to be shades. But there's different applications. Some are aero, that ground effects, and we saw them famously or infamously later on in the Pontiacs, where they looked a little bit like the old 70s Mercedes side cladding.
Starting with the 85 Grand Am.
Exactly. Now my shadow's on the car. I'm going to step back a little bit here.
Boy, I wonder what John would say about you calling that ribs there.
Well, I mean,
He was not a fan of the Pontiac
yeah.
ribs, but it is ribs.
They're louvers, but ribs, louvers, whatever. They're ridges, and then they're picking the same theme up graphically in the applied.
That's true.
Graphic sticky tape there. So
That's hilarious.
So you know it's on purpose, it's intentional, and it's a motif. It's definitely a design theme. But I see the rationale behind it because there's always a bit of it streamlines. It's a go faster, right? It visually lengthens and streamlines. It gives a shape.
Makes it look wider, too.
Makes it look wider. If it's applied in the back, makes it longer. It's applied on the side. It's a cheap trick, and sticky tape and putting decals on things is never a very high quality execution.
Kind of like a mini concave surface there, too, as opposed to just being flat.
So this is interesting because on the one hand, they're trying to integrate. So this is a beautiful example of how the 5-mile-an-hour bumper started evolving. We have flush execution on the side. And this filler cap that always falls out of the cars with the big steel bumpers, that's actually integrated into the whole plastic arrangement here. So you're lucky because this means the whole bumper will fall apart one day probably. But I think these are fiberglass. They're not this material they used in some of the filler panels in the 70s and early 80s. So if it's fiberglass, then it definitely will last a lot longer. But it's nicely integrated on this car. And in order to break up the mass, there's subtle little surface developments in here, like what you just pointed out, a little concave, little bevel here. So they are trying to take these very sheer and very clean shapes. They're very minimized. They're actually not very styled compared to what happened on the cars before. They're actually minimized, but they're trying to break up the volumes to give them a nice proportion, which I think they did very successfully too. The other thing that's evident in this generation of vehicles is the aluminum billet theme, which is something that GM was also very fond of. Again, the mid-70s, the Aston Martin Lagonda, and to a certain extent the Panther platform Lincolns, and some of those vehicles, they were definitely representations of that. The billet aluminum theme being a very sheer shape with simple bevel cuts that have a little bit of crown to give them tension, but not much of anything else in terms of surface sculpture. If you look at the earlier 70s cars, they're very organic. They have a lot of surface sculpture, entertainment, a lot of pizzazz and Las Vegas on the surfacing. These are very clean. They're almost functional. And in order to give them some life, they did a very sheer choice of how the body side bevels and then just the right amount of crown and tension to make the surface come alive and make it look good. Because if you don't have enough of that, then it looks flat and stale. And I think some of the contemporary Japanese cars of that era that were going Euro, they have that. They looked like folded paper, and they had really boring surfaces that kind of looked really stale very quickly. And that changed later on as they refined their approach to design. The cars got a lot more distinctive and had a lot more quality in the execution of the surfacing. But this one speaks of the really high quality in the execution of the surfacing. Little details like when we go here, that little step, the shoulder, and that very subtle crown over the rear wheels. If you look at this little fairing here, as the radius of the pillar comes into the rear deck area, there is a little vertical fairing that just fades out. That's a beautifully done piece of surface development that's also very difficult to execute. It's difficult to stamp. It's difficult to manufacture, but they did a very, very nice job.
That is beautiful. Like you said, it just
done.
fades out and kind of gets...
Right. And it becomes a vertical surface of the pillar. And they could have just run that pillared surface down and crashed right into the top surface here, but they did this little subtle detail, and they faired it out beautifully, and it comes flush right here, but it starts picking up about here, and then goes up, and it's a beautiful way of picking up the vertical surface of the pillar. Very subtle, very nicely done.
Now, you're also an interior expert, so you have to render your judgment on not the GM.
I wish you wouldn't
buzzard.
ask on this one. Well, this is Luckily, it's a very dark interior. It's a very, very sunny day, so the contrast is so high that we can't see any of it, and that's probably best.
You don't like
No,
the
actually,
faux Allen head theme here?
That's another thing. I mean, if you're faking something, please let it be wood or something else. No, they're faking screws, so that's the best. So you should zoom in on that. And
well, the best part is, I remember trying to take some of these door panels off. Some of these are real, some are fake, and you have to have the manual because they look convincing when they are fake.
Convincing. So this was a thing that we have to have exposed screws. So let's simulate more exposed screws for symmetry, which is really, I think they're taking it too far here. Very origami interior, very flat panel interior. I do like the deep hooded brows on top of the IP. The Corvette had a similar theme.
79, 80, Eldorado, 80.
Right, that was a very common theme. Yep.
This little double.
Yep. With that line molded in some of the Cadillacs that would be molded in simulated stitching.
Yep.
But it's a simplicity that's actually quite appealing. Because it gives you also a functional benefit of providing a deep cluster brow that hides the instruments from glare a little bit, and we can see that today because we're seeing the sun flaring up on the center console, but the instruments are perfectly shaded. And I think the simplicity is what's so appealing. Now, I think considering how much subtle curvature and tension and crown they added to the exterior, a little bit of that on the interior here wouldn't have been a bad idea to create a little bit more visual harmony. But I don't think they really cared that much in those days about the continuity and character between the interior and the exterior.
I do like the Viscount buckets and the shape that they have. It's kind of a...
What makes them a Viscount? I have no idea.
They're for English lords, Or...
The other thing that's interesting is that it's a very sporty, sort of almost like a fighter jet cockpit style in terms of the black color scheme and the way the cluster and the instruments are arranged in the console. And the door cards are very standard stock GM execution. The lowest cost possible is just a...
Even this plug, I think, is 82 only for where it'd be a crank handle on the manual window.
So there's plugs, and it's just a flat panel. The only formed part is the armrest and grab handle, but everything else is the typical, the fibrid or cardboard panel that's vinyl wrapped, and then it has a formed upper section, which is the way GM and many companies did door handles since the 1950s, really, because it's a very simple structure and a very simple way to manage the various areas of the door trim panel. And this was an era when most companies were moving beyond that. They had a lot of formed and slush cast and injection molded parts that had a lot more 3D than what we're seeing here. This is just a flat panel with some applied details, like this thing here, which is a little bit of bright work, and then a cloth insert. But in principle, this is no different from what hundreds of other cars had and that rolled off American assembly lines in those days.
It has a very expensive horn, too.
Well, it's the sound of quality, just like the door slamming
shut. It's like the door slamming shut.
Yes, that was, I think, the biggest Achilles heel of these cars was they were under-engineered in the structural, and the powertrains were strong relative to the Malaise era's limitations, but I think the structural integrity of this car is what lets it down, because they have about as much torsional rigidity as an overcooked spaghetti. I mean, they're just ridiculous. If you park on a slight rise or there's a pothole somewhere, chances are you won't be able to open the door. Or it opens itself, who knows. These cars are really interesting because they're actually quite beautiful. They're handsomely proportioned. They have some innovative features. They got very fast windshields, very fast backlights. They have these interesting engineering innovations like the all-glass hatch. Can we open this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is pretty good. It's got an integrated shade, which is
that
nice.
was a $25 option.
This was a $25 option.
There you go.
Wow. Well, it feels like it. But it's all glass. That's the thing. It's all glass, and the hinges are attached to the glass. And then it has a little pressed metal section here at the very back with a spoiler, but it's all glass. And very, very long lead for the wires for the heater wires here for the rear window defogger. Very, very light, almost impossibly thin looking, but it works. And the material engineering was far enough in those days to make these big dome-shaped glass panels that were strong enough to serve as a hatch, and it's beautiful. High lift over here, but what I do like about this is how thin the sections to the side are relative to today's cars. When you open the hatch on a contemporary SUV. It's all pillar. You have no sight line out back because the actual window you can see through is so narrow. Well, you've got basically everything here. The blackout of the blackout paint only really covers the seal, and this is all visibility, which is wonderful, which is something we're missing today. Of course, this would never survive the roof crush criteria of today either. But this is interesting. Is this all fuel tank,
Yeah,
rear
fuel
axle?
tank,
So
yeah.
here's a perfect example of solid axle engineering. You've got a fuel tank and you've got a solid axle. So this trunk is nothing. You can put 2 suitcases and a duffel bag in here.
Or the T-tops and an oil filter.
Yeah, which you must have, because this is all, the car is low to the ground, so the differential housing and the fuel tank take up a lot of height, and so your floor comes up to within a handspan
That's true.
of the rear window, so that's neat. But again, in all fairness, the car is very low to the ground. It's maybe, 50 inches tall or something like this?
I think that's about right.
And so, I mean, it's unavoidable when you have a live axle and a fuel tank there. This is what you get. So
The electrical for the rear window
lead,
departure,
yeah.
do they use this is to conduct the electricity? Do they use the rod?
I would say that's it. That's the contact point here. So you got a wire coming in right here, and I think they conduct it up through the gas
Wow,
strut.
I
Yeah.
never noticed that before.
Well, it's a clever way of integrating it, so you don't have to run it through here or whatever. So it's one way of getting the connection. I think that's, again, interesting innovation.
That is.
A little clever
Both
detail.
sides, yeah.
Yeah. I was still a little kid when these cars were new, and you did see them in Europe. Growing up in Germany, you didn't see many of them, but you did see them.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, for coming on and talking about the finer details of this 82 Trans Am. If the viewers like it, we'll see if Mark will come back again.
Well, you'll have me back anyway because you're going to run out of ideas.
Well, thank you, Mark.
But I had actually, this is the first time, I know you've had this car for a number of years, but this is the first time I've actually taken a long, close look at it. It is in remarkable shape. These cars are gone. They all fell victim to, second, third owner creativity and add-ons and custom kits and whatnot. And then they ended up on blocks in the finer subdivisions of America.
Yeah, they're
and disappeared. They're gone. And then also they self-destructed because of the poor assembly quality and the structural integrity or lack of it. So they tended to self-destruct, and they tended to be used up by aggressive drivers. So these are super rare today, way rarer than many so-called exotic cars, especially in this condition that's unmolested and all original.
Unmolested, all 165 horsepower of it.
Well, you don't want to...
But actually, driving it feels peppy. It just, if you
It's
have...
light.
Yeah, passing power doesn't have a lot of
It's light.
passing power.
And you don't want to get too crazy with something that has the aforementioned safety deficits compared to today's vehicles.
And the turbohydromatic 200 transmission.
And I'm not even saying this as a criticism of the cars of the era. It was what it was. It's just that people today drive very aggressively. When you have a classic,
Yeah.
and you're in an ocean of SUVs and giant pickup trucks, you're just not going to win any confrontation with anybody. So you don't want to, if there was any performance, you don't want to use too much of it anyway.
That's true. Well, thanks again, Mark. Until next time, take care.